And there it is. You see that? Few sessions of introduction and how-to. Now, a nice real-world session to kind of wrap that all up and show you how all those things come together to serve real customers. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Now, your next session. This is a goodie. This is one you better go and call your friends and tell them to get online for. Former Principal PM from the Flow team, Kent Weare, is bringing our next session, 5 tips when introducing your customers to Flow or PowerApps projects. This is one you're not going to want to miss. Kent always brings the heat and always has great things to say. I'm going to go ahead and let him finish up his intro. Kent, take it away.
Hello and welcome to the 5 tips when introducing Microsoft Flow and PowerApps to your organization or customers session. As part of this MVP Days conference, online conference, I want to thank John Levesque, Gabe, and Dave Koala for organizing this. I think this is a really great opportunity to interact with the community and build some unique content from people across the globe and be able to stream this all online and to be able to respond to questions on Twitter in real time. So feel free if you do have questions. I will be online during when recording is being played. You can at me at Weare, but happy to answer any questions as we go through this. So what is this talk about? So this talk is about governance and talking about how we're going to apply rigor in order to prevent unintended consequences. So as you can see here, there's a picture of a bowling alley and we've got bumpers that are existing in the gutters. And the idea is to keep the ball in play. And certainly this is one of the big concerns that a lot of organizations have. And certainly when I was at Microsoft, I was chatting with a lot of large organizations around governance and some of their concerns. And certainly I think the core concept is that I think generally IT departments do want to help, they do want to enable their business to do more, but they're concerned about the risks, they're concerned about the downside of giving too much power to end users. And I think there's a happy medium that can be struck, and I think this is part of the focus of this talk, where we're going to use governance and some techniques in order to make our business users productive, but still giving us some comfort knowing that they're not going too far or out of bounds or in the gutter. So security is another aspect. So security is really preventing unauthorized or unsanctioned activities from occurring. Another concept, and this was something as we were going through a lot of the governance sort of strategies and tooling at Microsoft, this was one thing that surprised us a little bit. And the visibility that we're going to show you in terms of how you can understand what your users are doing can use for more than just governance and can be used for more than just, say, cybersecurity and audit. It can also be used from an organizational change management perspective. Now, maybe you're not familiar with that term. It's also known as OCM. And really what this is driven from is as more and more technology is introduced into the enterprise, there are people generally that are put into these roles, and their role is to really embrace technology, educate end users, and really show them how they can leverage technology to get greater business outcomes. Now, I've seen this oftentimes with Office 365, and part of this was around Office 365 would roll out new services, and IT departments may get frustrated because we haven't even had a chance to look at this technology, yet we've got users now using this and perhaps even contacting the service desk. And so this is important from a Flow and PowerApps perspective, is actually identifying who are your champions and really identifying how are they using these technologies and how can you actually embrace them and actually get them to do more and actually get more value. So this is another lens that we're going to take a look at as we go through this specific talk. And so why this talk? Why am I choosing to do this talk? Well, there's a few different reasons. Naturally, when I was at Microsoft, this was an area of focus for me. So I'm pretty passionate about it. But I would say in addition to that, I've since joined a new organization, a customer organization. And so we don't have Flow or PowerApps, or at least not prior to me getting there. So certainly I understand the value of PowerApps and Flow and what are the opportunities, having seen some very successful and innovative companies adopt Flow and PowerApps while I was at Microsoft. And certainly I want to bring those opportunities to my organization. But on the flip side, I'm also aware of some of the challenges or some of the concerns that other organizations have had with a powerful tool like this. And so I think I can bring some pretty good perspective from a Microsoft perspective and some of the things that we thought about when I was there, and then now on the customer side, and say like, is this really important to me? Do I really need to do this? And if so, why? And what's the benefit? And I think that's the unique opportunity with this talk, is that I can bring both of those perspectives. So let's go ahead and dive into this. So let's talk a little bit about fear. Naturally, Flow and PowerApps, they're very powerful tools. And some IT groups feel they're losing too much control by putting these tools in the hands of end users. Generally, I'd say the main concern is related to data exfiltration. So what that means is really unintended data leaving your organization and going to another organization. Now that could be consumer-based service like a Twitter or a Dropbox or a Box, or it could be to a competitor, or it could be someone who's left a company and their account's still active and they're sending data to their new company. And regardless of the scenario, it is something you don't want to have happen. People spend a lot of money trying to protect the enterprise, and certainly we don't want to exfiltrate data. Naturally, IT groups haven't had a chance to certify the tool and don't want end users to get ahead. And so this was an interesting comment, and I'll be honest, I never really thought about it in this way, but it does make sense. When you think about the Office waffle, so really that's the 3 lines, and this isn't so much a concern anymore because Flow is now like a second click away, but generally when you would click on the waffle, you'll see all of the Office 365 services that are available. And some of the concerns are, well, if an icon shows up there, that's really like the IT department giving someone permission to go ahead and use the tool. And so this is a concern for folks, is that if they haven't had a chance to certify the tool, people are going to use it, and if they get stuck, where are they going to go? They're going to go to the service desk. And then the IT group may not be in a position to service them, which creates a lot of friction and concerns and angst. And so this is a problem. But I would also encourage IT departments, is you are considered to be the innovation engine of an organization. You do need to find ways to get ahead of this, because I'm telling you right now, if you don't get ahead of this, it's going to be way harder. And certainly from my perspective, joining this new role, one of the first things I'm doing is actually implementing governance, really the tools and techniques we're going to talk about in this presentation, so that I can get ahead of things, because it is way more difficult to pull a tool away from someone than to really provide those bumpers, as I showed you in the previous slide, before people can actually get their hands on the tool. So it is better to be proactive. It's best for everyone. And a lot of organizations would prefer to just bury these tools. Let's be honest. They just want to make it go away. But once again, it's the wrong attitude. It's, those organizations won't be competitive. And I think nowadays, the organizations that are going to win, they're going to win because they've been able to get on this treadmill of technology and they've been able to stay there. And that's key. This is where I want you to be at the end of this talk, where you're ahead, you're in the driver's seat, you have the opportunity to influence, you have the opportunity to actually bring more value to your organization, but it comes down to whether or not you choose to accept that road trip. But I'm here to give you the tools so that you can accept that road trip and you can lead your users to a great experience. All right, so 5 tips. Let's get into it. Now, you're going to see some themes here, and I'm a big fan of the NFL Network, and they always do these countdowns, and they naturally do the countdowns with people wearing the jersey of the number that they're on. So I'm also a big Arizona State fan. They've recently beaten the University of Arizona, their arch rival, in the Territorial Cup, and are on their way to the Las Vegas Bowl. So to celebrate their season, we're going to go with this Arizona State theme. And we're going to start with number 5. So not only are you going to learn about PowerApps and Flow, but you're also going to learn about ASU football. So this is the quarterback, senior, and this is Manny Wilkins. And so he's capped off a great year. And so we're going to start with environments, courtesy of Manny. What are environments? Environments provide isolation between apps and flows. And so what you can almost think about this as is, in your typical enterprise IT scenarios, you got a dev environment, you have a test environment, a production environment. And the purpose of these is that you have isolation, so that if you make a change to a dev environment, it doesn't have an impact in the test environment and so forth. You can think of environments in the same manner, where we have the ability to isolate different flows and Power Apps and choose to provide different, say, versions, or have just different functionalities. And there's a few different reasons why you may want to construct environments, and we'll We'll get into that in a little bit more detail here shortly. Data loss prevention policies can be applied to individual environments or tenants. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in an upcoming slide. But data loss prevention is really preventing connectors from talking to each other if you don't want them to. So for example, if you do not want to have, say, SharePoint Online and Twitter in the same flow, what you can do is create a DLP policy that prevents that. Now, this is a question that comes up and it's highly contested, or it's highly sensitive for some organizations. And this is, if you are a licensed user of PowerApps or Flow, you have maker rights inside of the default environment. Now, the default environment is what it sounds like. When you go ahead and provision the service and you sign into Flow or you sign into PowerApps, what's happening is an environment is getting provisioned for you under the hood. And this is what's called the default environment. And as part of this, every single user that's licensed has access to this environment to create flows or to create PowerApps. Now, you can create non-default environments. So these can be created by P2 users, where you have either purchased that license or you've signed up for a trial. You can go ahead and create non-default environments. Now, with non-default environments, you do have more control around permissions. So you can opt in specific users to have that maker privileges in non-default environments. And we'll talk about this on the next slide, why that might be important. Also note that the on-premises data gateway can only be created in one environment. So currently this lights up in the default environment, but it can be changed with a support ticket. So not super broadly known, but it definitely is possible if you create a support ticket. But do know you can't have multiple on-premises data gateways. You can still have one, but you can choose which environment it belongs to. So let's take a look at a sample configuration. And this is essentially what I've done at the new place. I've modified the name of the default environment to be called Personal Productivity. Now, as part of that, I want to enable people to be able to explore and to build within that environment. Subsequently, I've also created two other environments, a test environment and a production environment. And there's good uses for these environments. This is really when we want to build these apps that need to be managed. Perhaps they need to go through change control. Perhaps you want to restrict access to who can go ahead and create or use those apps. We can actually start to get into the finer permissions by using this sort of approach. So in summary, a personal productivity environment, we want to build flows and apps for personal usage. So when my boss emails me, send me a push notification, that's where it would live. You might want to connect to non-SOC systems. So perhaps SharePoint Online, you want to do a very simple approval inside of, say, a team site that you own. No problem, go for it. Open publishing rights, no problem. It's available, go ahead and use it. But if you want to build corporate apps or apps that have SOX implications, so the Sarbanes-Oxley requirement or regulation, you need to have some more change control around those types of apps. So this is where you want to restrict that access and set expectations around using test and prod environments so that you don't have users inadvertently pushing changes to a production app without going through change control, because that could be an audit issue. And so this is sort of the purpose of using a test environment and a prod environment. When it comes to test, there's looser change control because you don't have to go through change board for those. So you may want to limit the publishing rights through management connectors. I'm going to show you a strategy around that here shortly, but generally you'll leave it a little bit more open. You get to production, naturally you want a little bit tighter change control. So you might say, hey, only these people are allowed to publish apps to the production environment. Using the management connectors, you could actually enforce that by looking for new apps, seeing if they're part of a group, and if they're not part of the group, you could go ahead and delete the app or remove the permissions. So you have the choice. With these management connectors, you really control your own destiny. Now let's go and see a very short demo. So in this flow, what I want to be able to do is I want to remove unauthorized environments. Now we chatted about it before, that if you're a P2 license holder, you can go ahead and create environments. But there's really no good reason to start creating additional environments. All you're doing is creating sprawl, and you don't need it. You don't need to have 100 environments. It doesn't make sense. It becomes more difficult to manage, more difficult to apply DLP policies, and it just gets messy. So why bother? Let's go ahead. We're going to establish specific environments. We're going to create an Office 365 group that will contain group members that have the authority to create the environments. And so what I've done here is I've built a flow. And this is going to run on a schedule. It doesn't really matter. Every 2 hours, can be every day, which is more likely what I'll do with this. And we're going to go ahead and use the management connector. So this is the Power Platform Management Connector. And we're going to go ahead and get all of the environments. We'll also go ahead and get the group members for this specific group, which I'm just calling Power Platform Environment Creators. Next, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we will loop through each of the environments. Now, there is a subtle difference with the default environment where it doesn't have the user principal name or UPN of a user that created the environment. It's basically a system account inside of Microsoft that created that. So we're essentially going to do a check just so that we exclude that. Now, what we're going to do here is we are going to go ahead and check to see if the user principal is in the permit list. And how we're going to do that is we're basically going to get the list of group members from O365. We're going to convert it to a string, and then we're going to see if it contains this user principal name that actually created this specific environment that we're on. And then what we're going to do is if we find one, we're going to go ahead and send an email saying, hey, so-and-so, we see you've created this Power App or Flow environment called foo, and we're giving you 24 hours to go ahead and export those assets and move it to another environment. And if you don't, we're going to go ahead and remove them. The next thing we can do is create a delay. Now, for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to delay for a minute. Generally, this will be set to a day. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create this approval. And in this case, it's going to get sent to myself. It's going to give me information about the environment, who created it, the UPN, so I can follow up with them and ask more questions. And then what will happen is if I click on the approve button, we're going to go ahead and we're going to delete this specific environment. Now do note, and this is very important, you need to change the API version to this value, 2018-0101, because there has been an API change, and you can't use the default API version to delete CDS environments. So we're going to go ahead and use this. Also note that it looks like there's a bit of a race condition. So I have gone ahead and configure run after here to basically say failed or succeeded, because there is an error that'll get thrown back, which isn't really an error because the environment does get deleted. So I have reported that. It's a little bit odd, but this does work. Once the environment's deleted, we'll go ahead and send the email. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to go ahead and run a test now. So here we are, we're in the Flow Admin Center, and we can see we've got 3 different environments here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to log in with a separate account. This is my admin account. And I'm going to log in with another account where I have a P2 trial. I'm going to create an environment, and then we're going to run the process that'll go ahead and clean it up. And now what we'll do is we'll head over to our flow, and we're going to run the flow. And let's see what happens. So here we go. We can see that our flow has kicked off and has detected that an environment has been created called Flow Online Conf. And it's warning me to go and clean up any of my artifacts. And if I don't do that, this thing's going to get deleted. So we will, right now it's basically in this delay shape, and we should be getting an approval here shortly for me as the admin to go ahead and delete this environment. Okay, here we go. We have this approval in my inbox, and we can go ahead and approve this. And when we approve this, we're going to see that this environment gets deleted. So let's hit approve, confirm, flip over to admin, and sure enough, we can see that this environment is now gone. And you saw it before, it was there. So this process has essentially gone ahead and cleaned that up. All right, tip number 4, DLP policies, courtesy of Demario Richards. So DLP policies, they limit what connectors can be used with each other in an app or flow. You have 2 data groups, business and non-business. And what this allows you to do is any connectors that are grouped in business can communicate with each other. Any connectors that are grouped together in non-business, they can talk together. you can't talk across these different buckets or these different data groups. Now, there is a misconception. You're not disabling connectors when you put them into these different data groups. You are just saying what are the connectors that each group can talk to. By default, everything shows up in non-business, which means everything can talk to each other. Now, do note multiple DLP policies can be applied to an environment. You can layer them on top of each other, and basically the sort of most restrictive policy wins. So I bet you didn't know this, but you can actually create a DLP policy where you put a single connector in. And what that means is only that connector can talk to itself. Bet you didn't know that. So for example, you could go ahead and create a DLP policy and you only put Twitter in, say, the business data group. What that'll mean is only Twitter can talk to itself. So you could not take SharePoint and have it talk to Twitter. It'll only talk to itself. Now, use environments to isolate different scenarios. So this might be a justification for another environment, which is okay. So for example, you may not want to have your social media connectors, in your sort of default environment and have them talking to some of your business tools like Office 365. But for a corporate communication function, that's perfectly normal. So what you might do is say, I'm going to create an environment just for corporate communications. I'm then going to relax my DLP policy and allow Twitter to talk with, say, SharePoint Online. And I'm going to do this because I'm going to trust that group. And I'm also going to restrict who has access to this group. Now, do note, related to custom connectors, they are managed as part of the default data group. They don't show up by default, so you won't see an icon there. So what that means is if non-business data is your default group, if you have a custom connector, it'll be put in there. Now this is supported, and I'm going to let the product team go ahead and produce more documentation around this, but you can actually add a custom connector to a DLP policy through PowerShell or the management connectors. I've done it. It does exist. I'll let the product group share more details about that. Moving on to tip number 3. This is Eno Benjamin, a sophomore. Now, in this case, management connectors, the flow management connector has been around for probably about a year. What we did earlier in the spring, I guess summer, we added some additional management connectors around the Power Platform, so common assets or common functions like environments. DLP, they show up in Power Platform. We also have PowerApps, so PowerApps Admin and a PowerApps Maker management connector. And then we have something, the existing Flow, which is sort of a hybrid of admin and maker functions. And we also have the flow admin for admin related functions. These connectors are extremely powerful. And in this presentation, what I want to talk about is this leftmost template that was published that allows you to get a list of new PowerApps, flows, and connectors. So now you've got visibility into what is being created in all of your different environments. So what you can do is you can browse to your templates, do a search for flow management, go ahead and click on this specific template. It's very straightforward in terms of how you would provision this. Really all you need to worry about is what is the time frame or the window that you want to be able to look back on. Now for some people, they want to run this every day, so their window is essentially going to be just one day. So this is their reporting period. By default, it's 7. So what this will do is this will run every day and it'll look back 7 days, and then it's going to go through every environment and look up any new flows for that environment. We're going to check the date. If we find one, we're going to go ahead and append it to an array. We'll do something similar for the connectors. So new connectors put into an environment, and we'll do something similar for PowerApps. And what we'll do is we'll have 3 arrays at the end of the day, and we will go ahead and aggregate those arrays, and we will send them an email based upon the profile. So this is going to get the person who's created that flow, their profile, and it's going to basically send you an email. So let's take a look at what that email contains. So here it is here. We can see the environment, in this case personal productivity. We can see the different flows that have been created, who created them, the flow ID, the creation time. If we would have had any Power Apps created in the last 7 days, in this case we don't have any, they would show up here, similar information, name of Power App, who created it, timestamp, environment, etc. We also can now see connectors. right? So these are connectors that have been deployed in the last 7 days. We could also look for update time, but in this case we're focusing on created time. So we can see things like the Cloud App Security app from Microsoft, Windows Defender, ATP, WebEx Teams. So now we've got this insight. So for example, if we wanted to be able to manage our DLP policies, we can go ahead and do that by seeing what new connectors have appeared. We'll know that they show up in our default data group. If we want to move them up into our basically business data group, we can go ahead and do that. Now we've got this visibility. We also can see who's creating these flows in PowerApps, and from a change management perspective, this is also important. So next up, number 2, Mike Bercovici, former quarterback. For this one, we're going to talk about Office 365 security and audit. Now from a flow perspective, there are audit events that show up in the Office 365 Security and Compliance Center. And what you can do, and I'm not going to go through it in the interest of time here, but I have a full blog that I wrote previously on the Flow blog where you can get all of the details around this. And the purpose of the blog is to demonstrate how you can create webhooks against the Office 365 Security and Compliance data, and then actually use that data to actually enforce additional governance using the management connectors. So for example, if we wanted to know if someone is using an action that we don't want, perhaps it's the forward email action, we actually can go ahead and look for those events in Office 365, determine if that action is used inside of a flow definition, send an approval, and choose to go ahead and disable that flow. So this is more of an advanced pattern, but it's highly useful and really can address any gaps that you perceive in the existing governance story. So it becomes very powerful. Check out the blog. I think you're going to find that it's very useful and very powerful. Now last up, analytics, Nikhil Hari. Now analytics, there's 2 forms of analytics, admin analytics and maker analytics. Maker analytics naturally shows up in the maker portal. You do need P2. You also need P2 for admin analytics. Now from a requirements perspective, and we're going to focus on admin analytics, you do need tenant admin. That will change. The team is working on that. You do need a P2 license. You also need to have explicit environment admin rights. So that means you need to go into the old portal and go ahead and add your tenant admin user account to the admin group in order to have access to see it in the portal. This will change. It will get simpler. I know the team is working on it. All right, so here I'm in the Power Platform Admin Center, so admin.powerplatform.microsoft.com. I'm going to go ahead and click on Analytics. Now, we're going to focus on Flow for today because we don't have any PowerApps in this environment yet. But what we're going to do here is we're going to see the personal productivity environment, and we're going to see all of the different usage. Now, this is a new tenant, so in terms of usage, it's still sort of an evolution here. Here we can see the different flows that are running. If we've had failed flows, we can see different trending based on the day, the week, or the month. We can see usage. So these are the types of flows that are in use, whether they be event-driven, scheduled, or button-clicked. And we can also see the name of the flow and how many times it has been run. Another one is errors. This is a common concern for organizations, is they don't want to have flows that are just erroring out and basically wasting resources. So this is a way where you can detect some of the flows that are having some significant issues. I do know that the team is working on some additional fields here where you can capture or see who is the owner of those flows so that you can proactively reach out to them. Now this is probably the most popular and most sought after report, and that is around our connectors. So we can see the different types of connectors that are in use here, and we can see things like Office 365, email, RSS feeds, the Flow Push, Wunderlist, users, Flow Management, SharePoint Online, Forms, Yammer, etc. Now, if you had some consumer connectors being used, at least you'd get some visibility into this. So in summary, get ahead of your users. It's very difficult to remove tools, but proactively establish your policies. Use environments to segregate workloads. I gave you that example of test and prod, but we also talked about business unit isolation like corporate communications. Now, Microsoft wants to empower admins much like end users, so you do have a powerful tool. You have these management connectors. We didn't really talk about it much, but you also have PowerShell. As an admin, you can do a ton with this platform. Embrace it and be productive yourself. And lastly, leverage analytics data as part of your OCM practice. Identify champions, empower them. And much like good cybersecurity hygiene, Flow and PowerApps education is required too. Talk to your users about the do's and don'ts. And I think if you do that, you'll be well on your way to providing a safe and productive environment for your users.
All right, told you guys, Kent brings it every single time. Way to slay it, Kent, like always. Never doubted you, bro. Now, next up, we have a session about Flow's unconnected connectors. As you've seen so far, a lot of the connectors connect to different data sources. But did you know that Flow has a whole series of connectors that just manipulate data? You're gonna learn about those in the next session from Sandy Yu, brand new Flow MVP. Congrats, Sandy. You guys are in luck. I'm gonna go ahead and let Sandy intro her session and take it from here. Sandy, off to you.
Hi, I'm Sandy. In this session, we're going to look at some of Flow's unconnected connectors. By that I mean triggers and actions that don't actually connect to an external service. As you probably know, Flow has over 200 connectors to external services. But sometimes there are things that you want to do in your Flow that don't require one of these external services, and that's what we're going to look at today, sort of a whirlwind tour. So there are some basic categories that we're going to talk about, and we'll look at examples of each. They're a little bit random, but I think you'll find them useful. So the first one is Flow buttons. This is a trigger that you can use to start a flow without having a trigger action actually happening. You're manually triggering the flow, and you can include inputs in this trigger. You can just trigger it by itself, but you can also have text, Boolean, file, email, and number inputs that the user can add when they trigger the flow. And then, of course, those inputs can be used later in the flow. You can also trigger them on your mobile device through a Flow button on your phone. So for example, on the Flow conference Flow button, I've added some inputs of different data types. So I could, the user, when they click that button on their phone, they could enter the purpose, there's a happy yes or no, an email address to be emailed to later, a rating, which is a number, and file content lets you actually select files or images from your phone. The third screen there shows an example of uploading a file from either the camera on the phone or a photo library. You can also include Flow buttons which connect to physical buttons, but those are part of the external services, so we're not going to talk about them. The next type is notifications. These are actions. One is a mobile notification and the other is an email notification. And one thing to note here is that the notification goes to you, that is the Flow creator. So there is not a way in the notifications to have it notify someone else, but it's just to notify the creator of the Flow. And an example of the mobile notification is there's just a send me a mobile notification, and that could happen, anywhere in the Flow, and you can include a link in the mobile notification. And what will happen then is you get a little pop-up on your phone and it will usually buzz at you. This is, of course, if you have the Flow mobile app. And another thing to note is that the notifications will only come in on your phone if you're currently connected to the tenant, to the Office 365 tenant where the Flow was built. If you happen to be connected to a different tenant, then you're not going to get the notifications. And then I have an example of what the notification looks like, and then I can view, and in this case, the view is of a SharePoint list, and so it goes right to the mobile SharePoint experience. You can also get a notification. In this case, this is a Flow template that's on the Flow website. I find this one really useful personally. You can get a push notification when you receive an email from your boss. Of course, it doesn't have to be your boss. It can be anybody that you don't want to miss an email from. I don't know about you, but I have, I think, 4 different email accounts that where I get emails on my phone, and I get the email notifications, but of course there are so many that I don't want to miss ones from somebody important. So I've got Flow set up that I get a Flow notification if I get an email from particular senders that I definitely don't want to miss. The next type are control actions. These are actions that add logic. This is a fairly recent addition where the Flow team has put things like conditions and looping under one umbrella called control actions. So the first one we'll look at briefly is the condition control. And you'll find that when you go to add an action in Flow, this is at the top of the list of sort of popular actions so that it's still easy to get to. You don't have to go to control and then condition. But basically a condition lets you test something to be true or false. So as an example here, I had the purpose input on that flow button flow that I had earlier. And so since that's a text value, then I can, in the condition, check for is it equal to, or does it contain certain text, or begin with certain text, and so on. If that was a Boolean value that I was testing, then I can just test whether it's true or false. If it was numeric, then I can test things like if it's greater than or less than some value. And of course, the value that you're comparing to could also be a dynamic value. There's an advanced mode also with conditions, and I have a link there that shows you how you can use expressions within conditions. If you just enter a condition and then click on Edit in Advanced Mode, you can get an idea of what that advanced mode looks like. But the type of thing that lets you do is, for example, test conditions on multiple values and so on. The next one is apply to each. This is a looping control, and so this is typically used whenever there are multiple items. And in fact, Flow will automatically add an apply to each loop anytime you are using something that has multiple items. So as an example, here I'm getting attachments from emails that come in. So on a new email, it's going to do an apply to each attachment because, of course, there could be multiple attachments to an email. And in each case, then within the apply to each loop, it's going to, in this case, create a file in OneDrive and save those attachments using the name and the content of the attachments that came in on the email. I find this to be a really useful flow also because then my inbox isn't all cluttered up with attachments, or rather I don't have to go searching for them. I can go to my OneDrive and search for them that way. Another type of loop is a do until loop, and that lets you repeat what's inside the loop until some condition is met. So as an example, you could create a record and then wait until some field in that record has some value, such as approved, and then continue the flow. So the do until is sort of like a wait until, in a way. Scope is a way to group actions together, and then you can collapse them so that your flow diagram is kind of neater and simpler. And you can also, within that scope, set a run after for that whole set of grouped actions. So in other words, you could have that whole set of things run after the step before it had timed out or failed, for example. There's a good example of using scopes on Peter Veenstra's blog. I have a link there on the slide where he's using scopes to create a try, catch, and finally pattern, which is a common use among developers. Another control is the switch control. That is different from the condition in that it lets you perform different actions based on multiple values rather than just true false. So in this example, we have a switch on the importance of an incoming email. So if it's a high importance or low importance, or then there's always a default case, which is none of the above. But depending on what the importance of the email is, in this case, I'm creating a planner task in different buckets in Planner. But of course, you could do multiple other things. Anything where you have multiple values that you're testing. And the last control we're going to look at is terminate. That terminates your flow. And that's helpful during testing. For example, if you don't really need the whole flow to run every time that you're running a test, or you could use it inside a condition so that the flow will only continue if the condition is met. And then notice on the status, there are actually 3 different statuses that you can select from. There's failed, canceled, or succeeded. And so, for example, if you choose failed, or actually canceled too, I believe, then if the flow terminates, if it reaches that terminate action, then it'll show as a failed flow. But you could choose succeeded, meaning that yes, you really meant it to do that, and but you just want it to terminate. And on the failed option, and also if you add a custom status, you can add an error code and a message, which then you could view what that error code and message were in the flow run after it has run and terminated. Of course, you can't access those further on in the flow because the flow has terminated, but it's a handy action. Next, we'll look at some date and time and scheduling sorts of actions. So first is the schedule. And there's a trigger here called recurrence, and then also some actions. So the recurrence trigger lets you actually begin a flow based on some recurrence. It could be, as you see on the frequency, anything from so many seconds to so many months. So you could have something that actually recurs once a year on at a certain time. If you do it every 12 months, for example. And you can set a start time too, so you can get pretty advanced with this. So like you could have something that triggers once a week on Wednesday at 4 o'clock in the morning, as an example. This could be something like where you're checking, every so often you want to check values in a SharePoint list and see, whether something is coming up soon. I've used that before to sort of extend Flow's 30-day limitation by setting a flag value in SharePoint list items. So once a week, I check and see whether a date is within the next week. And if it is, I set the value to, this is a upcoming, a near-term event, I should say. And then based on when that, if it has changed to a near-term event, then I trigger another flow that does whatever actions I wanted it to do when it's been waiting for 3 months or something like that. The delays are actions, and that lets you either delay for some period of time, like so many seconds or up to months, and then something happens, or you can delay until a date and time. So in that case, you have to put in some sort of timestamp that says when you want to delay until. And most often, of course, you would probably have that be a piece of dynamic data, such as one of the date time actions. So basically what these are there are equivalent expressions for each of them, and you can see that on the right side there. But the Flow team has created these date time actions to make it a little easier to use than those equivalent expressions. So for example, there's the add to time action, which is equivalent to there's an add days, an add minutes, and add hours. So those are separate functions in the expressions, but in the add to time action, you get to just choose from a drop down, whether you want it days and what's your interval. And then you can use the output of that, for example, in a delay until. So in this example, it's taking the created date from a SharePoint item and waiting 5 days or adding 5 days to that, and then delaying until that calculated time, in other words, the 5 days. And that is a timestamp type of output. So that's what the delay until action requires. That's as opposed to having a function that says add days and then of the create item trigger, comma 5. So it's just a little more intuitive to use. And as you can see, there are multiple actions such as convert time zone, converting a time zone from, for example, to your current time zone from the time zone where an item was created, for example. You can get the current time, a future time, or a past time, and then you can subtract from time just like you can add. Next, we'll look at data operations. These are different actions to manipulate data. First up is compose, and that can be used to construct a value that's usually based on dynamic data, so that you can simplify, have more simple tokens later in actions or expressions. So you have the compose action, and you can put whatever in that input. So that could be expressions, it could be text, it could be just things that you type. You can actually type in an array, like with square brackets and with commas in between each of the array values, and then that compose, the output of the compose, then in that case would be an array. So that it's the output that then you can use later on in the flow. And this is typically used if you have a value that's not going to change. In other words, you want to create this value. So maybe you're even doing something like constructing a URL. You could use the compose for that, kind of adding together these different bits to create a URL, and then use that later on, just being able to use that single token rather than have the whole function wherever you're trying to use it. In the example here, I'm using compose to extract just the 2-digit year from the start date of an event, and then the output of that compose is just a 2-digit year, like 18, and then that can be used as perhaps a column in a SharePoint list. The create CSV table and HTML table are kind of similar. They each create a table from a JSON array, and then with the object being that then you can use that table output in, for example, an email. So in the example given here, I'm creating an HTML table from an action which got group members of an Azure AD group, and then in the Create HTML Table action, you can choose to include headers, so that gives you a nicely formatted table with headers. And then the columns, you can either have the built-in columns, just the default, or you can say custom, where you can label your own headers if you want to sort of give aliases to those headers. And so in this case, it's going to just list the name and the email coming out of that. And also if you only want to show certain ones of the columns, maybe you don't need to show all of the columns. And then in this example, in an email later, then you can just put that in the body, and then that gives you a nice HTML table, in this case, listing all of the members of a selected AD group. The filter array is another data operation action that is working on an array and allowing you to filter it, as it sounds like. So the idea being that you could reduce the number of things in your array so that just matching criteria that you provide. So the certain array element where it matches some particular value. Join and select kind of are two additional data operations. Join lets you delimit an array with some separator, with maybe a different separator. So for example, maybe you get back from some action an array that has commas in between email addresses, but you'd like to change those to semicolons so that you can use that in the to field of an email. So you can use the join to do that. And then select lets you in some way transform the objects in an array. So for example, adding, removing, or renaming elements, but just to be aware that you can't, with the select, you can't change the total number of elements, but you can like add one and remove one, but you can't change the total number. And then parse JSON is used to, if you have a JSON array, a JSON input that coming from some other action, then you can define a schema in the parse JSON action. And what you would normally do is have a part of the flow that you run initially so that you can get what the typical output of the action that outputs JSON is, and then copy that into the use sample payload to generate schema. That'll give you a window to copy that sample payload into, and then it generates the JSON schema that you see there, so you don't have to actually know what that schema is. And then in subsequent actions, then that then gives you the ability to access those items from the JSON. So for example, if there was an object in there called web URL, for example, then that lets you access that as that name, as web URL. I have a link there to John Liu's blog. He uses parse JSON a lot and has some good examples and discussion on how to go about using this and why. And lastly, we'll look at variables. So variables are all actions, and they allow you to set values. So you would use a variable when the value will probably be changing during the flow. So unlike compose, which would be used to set some sort of static value, a variable would typically change throughout the flow. You would always have to initialize a variable first, so use the initialize variable action, and that basically declares what type of data it's going to be. You see you've got choices like Boolean, integer, string, array. Your variable can be any of those things, and you can set an initial value for it if you care to also. And then you would use the set variable to set a new value. So somewhere else in the flow, probably after some other action has taken place, then you could set this variable to some dynamic value that came from some other action. I have a link here to Serge Luca's blog, and he here is showing how to use variables to implement a state workflow, which Flow doesn't have natively, but basically by setting variables to different values depending on what state things are in, you can basically implement a state machine. Another thing you can do with variables is append to them. So if they are either a string or an array, you can append, have an action to append to whatever the variable is. So in this example, I've got a variable called recipients that is recipients of an email, and it's based on a multi-value user field in SharePoint, in a SharePoint list in this case. And so because it's multi-value, there can be multiple users listed in that field. Then there's an apply to each loop applied to each recipient. And within that loop, we can append to that string variable, the recipients, the next recipient's email. So one of those other, each user that was named in the SharePoint list, and with a comma at the end so that it makes a nice list. And then the way I'm using that is in an email later on, letting somebody know that in this case, a transmittal was sent to all of the following people. And so it has that variable recipients, which is then a comma delimited list of all of the recipients who received that. And lastly, you can increment or decrement variables. You would always use them within a loop. So in this example, I'm getting items from a SharePoint list. So that means all of the items in the SharePoint list. And so there's an apply to each loop that comes after that because it's multiple items. And I'm incrementing a variable called items processed so that each time it loops through one of the items, it adds the value 1, to the items processed. And of course, I had to initialize that variable prior to entering the loop. It just initialized it as a numeric variable. And then in this case, what I'm trying to do is get attachments on each of the items in the list and basically put them into a document library as separate documents. So I want to get attachments, and of course there could be multiple attachments on each item, so that sets off another apply to each loop. And I have another variable for attachments processed, and each time it loops through that, it's going to add 1. So in the end, then I'm going to send an email that includes the values that each of those variables ended up being. X number of attachments were processed from X number of items. And that's our little brief tour of the unconnected connectors in Flow. Thanks.
Showing off, dropping knowledge, teaching us about all the unconnected connectors. That's exciting to say, unconnected connectors. You should try it. All right, anyways, on to the next. This next session is called Upgrade Your Skill Set. And that's exactly what it's gonna do. It's going to teach you modern out-of-box approvals, and who's the teacher? Laura Rogers, the one and only IW mentor. You guys know her. Without further ado, Laura, please introduce us and take us away.
Hello, I'm Laura Rogers, and welcome to my session. It's called Upgrade Your Skills, Modern Out-of-the-Box Approvals. Let's get started. A little bit about myself real quick. I am a Microsoft MVP, and I live in Birmingham, Alabama. My training company is called IW Mentor. I've written some SharePoint books over the years. I've got a blog, wonderlaura.com, and you can follow me on Twitter at wonderlaura. All right, here is a bit about our agenda today. We're going to talk about just quickly the concept of workflows and the fact that they are all over the place in our organizations. We're going to talk about those old out-of-the-box SharePoint workflows and the way we used to do things. We'll talk about out-of-the-box approval concepts, and then introduce Microsoft Flow and go talk about things we can do, easy ways we can create workflows and empower our end users to do them themselves. And then we'll go beyond out of the box and we'll talk a little bit about, touch on some real world scenarios and things that we can do in Microsoft Flow beyond what it offers out of the box once you start customizing them yourself. Workflows are everywhere. They are in our organization. They might be paper workflows where people print things out and pass them around. They might be online forms. They might be PDF files. But whether we like it or not, our workplace is full of workflows. And Microsoft has provided these great technologies that let us automate things and save your information workers some time and make their jobs much more efficient by automating some of their workflows and improving that accountability and improving the overall processes in your company. Do you remember those old retro, those old-fashioned SharePoint workflows that we used to do? So we had 2007, we had out-of-the-box browser-based workflows, and we had SharePoint Designer 2007. We had SharePoint 2010 workflows that we had some that were browser-based that you didn't need SharePoint Designer for, and some that we had this built-in task process designer that was a good way to automate some of those processes. And then in 2013, it still uses the 2010 out-of-the-box workflows in the browser. And then, of course, we had SharePoint Designer 2013. Aren't you glad that we've moved on and we don't need to use those anymore? All right, before we dig into Microsoft Flow, we're going to talk about some simple approval options, just what exists out of the box, just the very least common denominator, things that have been in there a while and things that you can, ways that you can empower your end users to quickly and easily do small approval processes. First of all, we have in every list and library, it's always been there, we have a setting called the content approval setting. And this is basically the ability to turn on moderation. There's also a new concept for having to do with very simple approvals. It's called request sign-off. And this uses Flow and an approval action, but doesn't actually require you to go to the Flow interface and configure anything or actually create a flow. It is a completely built-in flow that is not customizable. So those are our two very basic out-of-the-box approval options, and we'll dig a little bit more into those before we move on to moving beyond out-of-the-box. All right, we have content approval. Again, it's been in there for years. It's available in all lists and libraries. This is moderation. It basically anytime an item is added or edited in that list or library, it's going to be set to pending, waiting to be approved. and then you have to have a certain level of permission, a permission to be able to approve things in that list or library. And the moderators aren't necessarily going to automatically get a notification, but they can just set up those good old SharePoint alerts to be notified about things happening in that list or library. Now, request sign-off is this new out-of-the-box concept. It is turned on by default in both lists and libraries, and it is something that you are going to manually trigger when you select an item. The process is very simple. You select one item or one file, you click to start that request sign-off flow, and you pick one or more approvers, and you write a message and go. And now take a look. This is what the email looks like that the person receives. They have some simple buttons directly in the email that allow them to not only click approve or reject, or they can actually type comments in the email and submit it as if it was a form. When they respond, their response goes directly back into the workflow and the workflow proceeds. And that's all there is to it. All right, there's another setting in your flow drop-down box in your library besides request sign-off. It's called configure flows. So let's talk a little bit, let's dig a little bit more into what exactly that means. First of all, you have to have permissions to be able to manage that list, to be able to actually do the configuration. Everyone will see the button, but you have to have configure manage list to be able to actually change the setting. The setting is basically a toggle switch that says, do you want approvals in this library on or off? Now that's a little confusing. So what exactly does that mean? So then it has a section below that says select the approval mode for this library. And you have to choose one of the following: a request sign off or content approval. Request sign off is that new out of the box, flow, and content approval is the old school thing that's been around for a really long time. So what exactly happens when you change that setting? All right, for the do you want approvals in this library, if that toggle switch is turned to off, the request sign off option will not show anymore in your flow drop-down box. That's all that toggle switch does, is turn request sign off off. Now, when it comes to the approval mode and what the two options, request sign off or content approval, what exactly do those do? So I created a table here to explain it. When you choose request sign off, it turns the content approval setting in your list off. And you still have the request sign off in the drop down, and you can create and use any other flows. And you can't use sign off and content approval together. When content approval list setting is on, then your content approval is on, that old school setting that's been there forever, but then your request sign off drop down is off. And either way, you still can create or use any other flows. And either way, you still can't use sign off and content approval together. So that is what that is all about. Now that we've established what that content approval does, what the request sign off does, and what some of those new settings are in your library, let's talk about that actual experience for end users when they are assigned the approvals, when they go through that experience of approving and rejecting things, getting those emails. So for end users, there's an approvals webpage. When you go to flow.microsoft.com, you go to Flow in your app launcher, or you go to your Flow app, mobile app, you're going to have an approvals page where you can see your received requests, sent requests, your history of approvals. You can create a new flow from there, and you can even look at the whole list of past approvals and filter and view those. And you can even optionally reassign approvals to other people. All right, now let's talk a little bit about Microsoft Flow itself and some of the still on the quick, easy side things that you can do within Flow beyond request sign-off. You can go to this Flow page, flow.microsoft.com, and you have this visual workflow creation platform. You are going to see the flows, the list of flows that you've created, and you're going to see team flows. And for each flow, you're going to be able to do things like view all the logs, share the flow with other people, make a copy of a flow, see analytics on that flow, and even run tests. All right, when it comes to flow design, what you're going to do is you can start with a blank flow, or you can start from a template. You can then pick a trigger, so you have to decide what's going to kick off your flow, what action happening is going to start the flow. And then from there, you build your flow out with multiple actions, conditions. You can even do looping and parallel branches when you get advanced. Here's an example of what the interface looks like for a fairly complex workflow. There are a lot of templates out there. So sort of between doing request sign-off, which is very simple, and starting a flow from scratch and building it yourself, the next step in between those is going to be templates. So templates are a great way to either get started and simply use what the template has, or use them as a learning tool and start creating a template and then dig around in it to see how certain things were done. We have templates for documents. Templates can even be used directly from within your list or library when you start creating a flow from there. You have a lot of different things you can do for documents, such as saving email attachments, copying files from one place to another, one environment to another, getting signatures, posting to Yammer. You can see these are a lot of examples of things that you can do just with files in SharePoint, and a lot of examples of interacting with other systems as well, as you can see here. There are also a lot of templates that you can do that you can use for SharePoint list items. And again, a lot of these are really useful if you just use what they have and just use it on one of your lists in your site, or by creating a bunch of flows using the templates and using them as a learning tool to look through. So as you can see, the templates are all here on the Flow site that can be searched, and there are categories, or from within your SharePoint site, from within a list or library, you can create a flow from the template there as well. And what it will do is it will create that template and take you over to the Flow interface. All right, it is time to level up. We've talked about content approval, very simple. We've talked about request sign-off. We've talked about some flow templates, again, very simple. And then beyond that is where we get to custom flows, where you can pretty much make them do whatever you want and interact with over 200 different services and databases. So let's go beyond out of the box and talk about what we can do when it comes to the best actions that are useful when it comes to approval processes, specifically in Flow. Approvals is the action that utilizes that approval interface on the Flow page and uses all those built-in approvals. Send email with options is a great one. It will send an email with a couple of buttons in it, and the end user will click to pick a specific option, and the flow will keep running from there, and you can make the flow do different things depending on what they picked. You can assign planner tasks to people, and Outlook tasks and Microsoft To Do are in there, but they only apply to the current person. So you can't actually assign things to other people from using those actions. And then we talked about content approval status earlier. You can actually set content approval status with a flow. All right, so let's talk about some common typical workflow requirements that you're going to want to use flow for that request sign-off is not going to accommodate for. The first one is automatically getting the manager of someone. Knowing when someone's out of office when we send them an email or send them an approval flow. We can work with shared mailboxes, which means that we can have a specific mailbox that actually can send and receive flow automated emails. We can tie into content approval. Flow can also accommodate for overdue notifications. And of course, any outcomes other than approve or reject, because that approval action is only right now only has approve and reject as your outcomes. As we delve through all of these special actions that I want to highlight, I'm going to go ahead and create a new flow so I can show you those actions in action. I'm going to go ahead and just create a manually triggered flow for simplicity's sake for this demo. All right, the first action that I want to talk to you about is Get Manager. It is in the Office 365 Users connector. And as you can see here, there are a lot of different things we can do with profile properties and searching for users and getting information about people and everything in their profile. But there's specifically one called Get Manager, and all you do is tell it which user and to get the manager of that user. So in this case, I could say I want just the user that triggered this flow, and it will return me their manager. Next, I'll go ahead and show you the approvals action. The first thing to do is pick whether you'd like anyone, just one person from the list of people to be able to approve it, or if every single person that you send this to has to approve it. We'll call this test approval, and I can use that manager information to assign the approval to them. I could put more than one approver in this box. Requester is going to be who is the one requesting that approval. In this case, it will be the person who manually triggered the flow. And in the details, item link, and item description, that's where you'll be able to put detailed information that you want to be in the approval for them to be able to click to look at a document or click for further information. And your description, in your description, you can put a lot of information. You can put a lot of metadata from the document or item that you're sending to them. And the more information you put in this approval, the quicker and easier it will be for them to know what they're approving, to be able to see more information about it. Now, instead of doing this approval and using the whole approvals interface, you could delete this. Instead of using that, you could use the send email with options. It's a little different. It doesn't use the approvals interface at all. See, send email with options. And here's also where you're going to find send an email from a shared mailbox. If you want your flow to send the emails so that the emails don't come from the person running the flow. All right, I'm going to send this to the manager. All right, so this email is going to send them options in an email to be able to click one. From there, you can make your workflow do different things depending on what option they selected. For example, I can use this thing called a switch. Switch is good when you have more than two options. Otherwise, a condition is good if you just have two different things they could pick from. But so I have selected option, which is what they click on, and if they choose, let's see, let me shrink this down. So you can make the workflow go down and actually do different things depending on what they pick, or you can just simply collect what their answer is and do something like write it to a SharePoint list or a spreadsheet. So that's how beneficial the the email with options is, because you can make the options be whatever you want. And it's easy because they're just clicking a button in an email. All right, in this next pretty complex workflow, we're going to talk about the content approval setting, and we're going to talk about the concept of finding out if someone's out of the office or not. For this, I had to zoom way out on this monitor, so the big one. All right, when a file is created in the library, I'm going to initialize a variable and get the person's manager. Possibly there might not be a manager in Active Directory for this person. So if not, it's actually going to send a notification and the whole workflow is going to stop. That is done with what's called a run after in Flow. So if the workflow is failed, it's going to this branch and it's going to send an email notification, and it won't go and won't do the rest of the workflow. All right, I'm going to set a variable, initialize the variable. Now I'm going to set it to whoever the manager is. Then I'm going to do an action called get mail tips for a mailbox. So this is basically finding out if the manager has their out of the box setting in their Outlook turned on or not. And all it's really doing in this condition is looking to see if their out of office message is empty or not. So this is a pretty complex little syntax here, but it's basically looking to see if the message is empty. If the message is empty, that means they are in the office. If it's not empty, that means they're out of the office. And we're going to, of course, depends on what your requirements are in your situation, but we're going to go ahead and say the backup person, if the manager's out, is their manager. So we're going to get the manager's manager. And then we're going to change that approval to variable to actually have both of those people in it, the manager and the manager's manager. And if there's no manager's manager, there's going to be a notification and it'll stop. Then it's pretty simple from there. We start an approval and we're using that approval to variable as the assign to. and of course giving them a link to the item to approve. And this is where we're tapping into that content approval. So then before we actually decide, whether they approved it or not and change the content approval, we actually have to change the content approval to submit. See, it says action submit. Then we decide if they approve or not. So if their response in their approval is equal to approve, then it's going to do this content approval setting and set the content approval to approve. You can also add, send the person an email, whatever else you want it to do if it's approved. And if it is not equal to approved, it's going to set the content approval setting to rejected. All right, so we've encompassed how to work with a content approval in SharePoint and how to do something with that out of office and find out whether someone's out of the office or not. All right, so that just about wraps it up. This is a pretty short half-hour session. So your takeaways are: the request sign-off is new and very simple. Content approval is a list or library setting that lets you do moderation. Flows can do pretty much anything beyond that free form. And I just wanted to thank you all for coming. Check out my SharePoint and PowerApps training site, IW Mentor. And thanks for coming to the conference.
Man, Laura Rogers is one heck of a teacher. Every time she shows me all sorts of new things that I didn't quite know before or didn't think of that way. Great job, Laura. Thank you for your session. Next up, there are still some of us that are using our data on-prem. And so we wanted to make sure that in our myriad of sessions today, we covered on-premises data and using the gateway. And so I'm going to go ahead and let Daniel Glenn jump into using your on-prem data with Power BI, PowerApps, and Microsoft Flow. Daniel, take it away, buddy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Glenn, and today I'm here to talk to you about using your on-prem data with cloud tools, PowerApps, Power BI, and Microsoft Flow. You can, if you have any questions after today, you can hit me up on the socials there. I'd love to chat with you and get you hooked up with more information. Today's agenda is, again, using your data in the cloud. So we'll talk about how we enable that by using the data gateway. What is the data gateway and why use it? And then we're just going to dive in and do some demo on connecting to your data. Using Flow, we're going to move some data around in SharePoint, and then we're going to report on data using Power BI. So I hope you'll, that's what you're here for. It's going to be awesome. Let's level set a little bit just to make sure we understand what we're talking about here. Data is the core of any business, and whether that's orders or that's customer data, that's employee data, we all work with data in some form. So it's very important for us to be able to work with that data no matter where it is. And we're able to do that with the business application platform. We're able to measure and act and automate data. And Microsoft enables that with measuring data with Power BI, act on the data with PowerApps, with forms, and enabling your users to interact. And then automating, moving that data or making modifications with that data, calculations, etc. with Microsoft Flow. And then we can extend each one of those through development. And then we connect all of that through common data service with content and connectors and gateways. And so today we're talking about those three things: Power BI, PowerApps, and Microsoft Flow, and concentrating on those connectors and gateways. All right, so for your gateway configuration, we need to identify a gateway server. What the gateway is going to do is interact. It's going to enable that interaction with the cloud tools with your on-prem. So you need to identify what's the best for a gateway server. First of all, you need it to be running all the time, at least if it's in production. So if you are running a gateway server all the time, what best to use in your environment is up to you. So it could be a dedicated server for this case. It could be an existing server that you're using. So maybe that's your database server or the like. The only thing it can't be, and a lot of people ask me, hey, can I put this on my domain controller that's always running, hopefully? Can I install it? No, that you cannot install the data gateway on your domain controller. So pick another server. And really, we also have to talk about resources. It is recommended that you have 8 core CPU, 8 gigs of RAM at least on that server. Windows 2010 Windows Server 2012 are 2 at least. Later is better. And we'll talk about why those resources are needed here in a moment. The next step is to install the data gateway. Once you then install it, then you connect it with Azure to let those services know that that data gateway is available and is connected to you. So let's go ahead and jump in. I'll show you how to download and install the data gateway. When you're on the Flow website, you can download the gateway by clicking the downward arrow here and saying Data Gateway. You can also do it on PowerApps site, on the Power BI site. So you can click the downward arrow here, click Data Gateway, and it takes you to the download website. So I'm going to download the gateway. I'm going to click Run because I want to go ahead and run the installer. And gives you a little information about what gateways are doing. So it should be, just like I told you, it says gateway should be installed on a computer that is always on. That's for production, especially for if you're using flows, and if you're just doing testing, that's fine. But if your gateway goes down, then your flows will actually error and you'll get some messages. Okay, so and then if it's on a wireless network, performance is going to be slower. And again, I'll talk to you about what's going on here in a little moment. All right, so we're going to click Next. We're going to pick the, because I downloaded it from Power BI, I have the decision to make whether I want personal mode or just I don't choose personal mode. I highly recommend you don't. So we're going to choose the On-Premesis Data Gateway. And this is getting everything ready, all the components to prepare for the install. All right, so again, we get our reminders again. This is making sure that our install is on a always on machine. Choose where you want to install it. I'm going to select the C drive here. And then accept the terms of use and privacy statement. Actually read those. I highly recommend you read those. So go ahead and hit pause, and if you're following along, you can go ahead and read those. And I'm going to click Install. While that's installing, I want to switch back and let's talk about what is actually going on with the data gateway and how it communicates. So we have our cloud services up here, and again, we're going to be focusing on these 3 over here for today, Power BI and Flow and PowerApps along with Flow. And then we have the on-prem data gateway here. And then we have our on-prem data sources, so SQL Server, SharePoint files, etc. So what happens is when I create a Microsoft Flow, for instance, to connect to SQL Server, what is happening is Flow on a schedule, it goes out and says, hey, I need to go check to see if there's been an update to that SQL table. So it creates a query, sends it through the Gateway Cloud Service and Azure Service Bus, and it just queues those queries up. Okay, so you can have many flows running, connecting to your on-prem data sources, and those queries queue up here. Your on-prem data gateway then, on a frequent basis, goes to the Azure Service Bus and says, hey, do you have any queries for me? If it's the right data gateway that corresponds with those queries, then it takes those queries, brings them onto the data gateway, decrypts it, that package, and then says, okay, what is this? It's a query for this SQL table, for instance. Okay, great, I'm going to send it. It then receives the response back, takes that data, encrypts it, sends it back through the Azure Service Bus. Then Microsoft Flow queries and says, have I gotten a response to my query through the Gateway Cloud Service? And when it does, it receives it, takes the content and processes it for it to continue. So point that I mentioned before about the resources needed for your data gateway, for it to be a little bit of a beefy box. Let's not wimp out here on this, because you can think about all the communications that's happening with the data gateway. It's also doing a lot of encrypting and decrypting, so it needs that processing power. So we do not want to skimp on that processing power. You will see some lag going on if you don't have enough CPU and RAM. So just monitor those resources and make sure you have enough, okay? And if you're being pegged and it's using 100% or close to it, then you're going to need to increase that. Another question I've been asked before is, can this be a virtual machine? Absolutely, this can be a virtual machine for your data gateway. Again, it could be a shared resource that's performing another, maybe a web server or something, but just keep track of the resources that are being used, the network connectivity. Another point I wanted to make is the location of your data gateway. If you have multiple data centers, maybe spread across the country or around the world, and most of your data is in site A, in the data center A, or maybe even a half of it or a good portion of it, and your data gateway is in another data center. Just to remember what that data gateway is doing. It's having to process the queries from the cloud, send the queries to whatever data it's trying to grab, process, bring it back, and then send it up. So you're increasing that network traffic and latency. Okay, so bring your data gateway closer to the data it's going to access. So having multiple data gateways is a good thing, especially if you have a lot of sources that you're going to connect to, and especially if they're in different locations. Okay. All right, let's put this to work. Let's talk about what we're going to do today. We're going to use SharePoint Online. We are doing, I'm going to have a form, I'll show you that in a second. Microsoft Flow to move data. And then I'll talk about creating connectors and such in Microsoft Flow, and those are shared with PowerApps. And then Power BI, we're going to report on some SQL data, some tables in SQL Server. I mentioned SQL. On-premises, we have SQL Server, and we have a SharePoint server installed, and we're going to be using it as well. All right. How we're going to use that. So SharePoint Online, we're going to fill out a form, and Microsoft Flow is going to take that data, move it to Microsoft SQL Server. Remember, that is on-prem. Then we're going to do a SharePoint server, which is on-prem. We're going to use Microsoft Flow, which is, of course, in the cloud, to move data from SharePoint Server on-prem to SQL Server on-prem. And then we're going to do, we're going to take SQL Server, we're going to take some table information that's in a table, use Power BI to create a report on that data, and publish it to Power BI service, and see that content being reflected in Power BI. All right. So let's go back to our server, and the installation was successful. Yay! So we're going to enter the email address that we will use with this gateway. Again, this is the connecting with Azure part, so that we can so it knows that this data gateway exists. I'm going to register a new data gateway. I'm not going to restore. We can restore a gateway. Remember, this gateway is registering with Azure. So if we've registered one before and maybe the server has died, blue screen of death, we can't get it back, you can install the data gateway again on another server and then do a restore or a takeover an existing gateway that's already been registered. To do that, you will need the recovery key. Okay, so I just selected do a new one here, and I'm going to put in a recovery key. So when you're creating data gateways, please take note of your recovery keys. Put those in your lockbox, so your password lockbox that you have for your company. Okay, so here's the data gateway name. Let's call it MVP Days. My super secret password, PASS. All right. Before I click configure here, one note I wanted to make is we can add this to a gateway cluster. We can create gateway clusters. So if high availability is your thing and it is needed, then you most certainly can do that. All right. Click configure. Once this is finished configuring, I highly suggest one change to the data gateway. I was talking about that communication. Your data is encrypted as it moves back and forth between the cloud and your on-prem. However, it does go over port 80 by default. Some people don't like that. So if you want your transport layer as well as your data layer being encrypted, come to the network tab and turn on HTTPS mode. You will need to restart the data gateway. It'll tell you here that, hey, you'll need to do that. So let's apply and restart the gateway. And then once the data gateway has been restarted, let's use it. Okay. So the first situation I mentioned we were going to do was a SharePoint Online, moving data from there into SQL Server. Okay. So let's go to that has restarted. Here is the SharePoint Online site. I've got a simple list here for events. Okay. And I want to use that list, this SharePoint Online list, for when I create an item, I want to move that content into a SQL table. Okay, and let's see, that SQL table is here. There's only one event in there. So great, we'll know what's there. Okay, before we create the event to move into SQL, we have to create the flow. All right, so let's go to My Flows. And then I'm going to create a new flow. Oh, actually, I'm going to stop here. You can create a flow, and then while you're creating the flow, create your connectors to that data. But I actually like pre-creating my connectors, so it's easier to select. So let's go to the gear and select connections. And then from here, we can click the new connection button at the top. Select what kind of connection it is. I already have one for SharePoint Online, okay? But I need one for SQL Server, for the on-prem SQL Server. So I'm going to select SQL Server. I'm going to use an on-premises data gateway. So it's going to ask me what gateway here at the bottom of this form. So I need to enter the SQL Server name, and that is that. The database name is events. And then the authentication type, this is my my user account that has permissions to that database. You will need, obviously, permissions to write to that database, okay? And if I can remember my password. And here is where I need to select my data gateway. I already have an existing one there, but I want to select my MVP Days data gateway that I just created. All right, and then I'm going to create that connection. All right. So what it's doing now is it's actually going and trying to connect to that SQL server to make sure I actually have access. So it passed. While I'm here, I'm actually going to create one to SharePoint as well. Okay. I'm going to go through the same thing, and I'm going to click SharePoint. Use the On-Premises Data Gateway, Windows. And again, I'm going to type in my username that I'm going to use to connect. Choosing MVP Days again. That's a data gateway we just created. Click Create. Again, does the same thing. It goes through the data gateway to make sure I have access. Done. All right, now let's go create a new flow. We'll go to My Flows, and the first one I want to create is an item. When an item in SharePoint is created, I want to move that to the SQL server. Okay. All right, so first off, in the trigger, I want to make sure I have the right connection. So I want the SharePoint Online one, not the on-prem one. So I'll select that one. And then I want to select the site. It is the product site and the SPO events. My next step, I'm going to type in SQL here to filter my choices because I'm connecting to SQL Server. I want to insert a row. Make sure my connection to SQL Server is the right one. So making sure that I am using the correct data gateway, and I am. You'll notice that I pointed to the database when I created the connection, the connector to this. And so now it's pulling in the tables. This is dynamic. Okay, this is great. So I can select the table I want. Now it gives me all of the columns that are in that table. So event name, I select that to get the dynamic content that I want to pick that is coming from, you'll notice over here, all of the SharePoint, or the SharePoint list, the SharePoint columns. So event name, let's go with, I think it's called SPO event name is what I called it to differentiate it from on-prem. Expected attendees, the date, let's skip date. Let's do topic. I want to select the topic, and then I'm going to leave the event ID blank. So I have my flow. I can save it now, and then I'm going to. You can rename it. You guys know that, right? You're flow experts. So I'm going to go to the flow screen. It's enabled, and let's go test it. Okay, so we're going to click New here. This is a new event name. We're going to call it MVP Days Watch Party. Expected. We're going to have a bunch of people. We're going to have 500 people come. The event day, let's give them time to process. We'll say it's the 28th of November. And the topic, we can select, this is a SharePoint selection here, choice field. This is all about flow. So we're going to select flow and then click save. All right, so we saved a new item. It's down here in our SharePoint list. And now Microsoft Flow on its timer is going to be checking that SharePoint Online list for any updates. And when it sees one, it will then process it and move it down to SQL Server. So I'm going to take a sneak peek over here and say, hey, has it gotten there yet? Well, oops, sorry about that. Let's go back. And it has indeed gotten there. MVP Days Watch Party. All right. So again, what we just did, we have SharePoint Online. Flow watched that list. When an item was created in SharePoint Online, it moved it down to on-prem in our SQL Server. Okay, that's great, Daniel. Let's do one that's the SharePoint site, or the SharePoint on-prem. So we're going to use on-prem, a cloud tool to Flow to watch on-prem and move it just in on-prem. Okay, so here's my events list. So let's go create a flow based on that. All right. create a new flow. Same, I'm going to select the same when a new item is created in SharePoint. Remember, we need to check our connection. It is using the data gateway. I have found quite frequently that when selecting this, it does not find the URL for the site. So I have to enter custom value. I enter my SharePoint site. But then it should go out and grab the lists that are available, and it did. Okay, so this is the on-prem SharePoint server list. New step, same thing. I'm going to select SQL, insert a row into SQL Server. I'm going to make sure that my data connection is correct. Yep, same one. All right, so this is, again, dynamic content, but this is coming from SharePoint server on-prem. All right, so event name, expected attendees, date, let's do, we'll select the event date there, topic, we'll do topic value there, and then we're done. So I'm going to click save. Simple as that. All right. So I've saved that flow. So it's saving. We'll go to my flows. And of course you're going to want to rename this, right? But let's go to my site. Let's create a new event. Remember, this is on-prem SharePoint. All right. So let's do a lunch and learn. Probably 100 people come. The date, let's call it the 29th. The topic, maybe we do it on OneDrive. Sure, why not? All right, and we're going to click save. Okay, so we've added our first item to this SharePoint list. Now, we're dependent upon the timers of Flow going out there and checking. So I'm going to come back to this actually, because I wanted to talk a little bit about Power BI. I have Power BI desktop here running. I've connected it to a database on the SQL Server. I have created to a table, and then I've created this simple visual showing this visual showing the sales, the subtotal sales for each year. It's historical data, 10 years ago. When you have this connected, I'm still on-prem, right? My SQL Server is on-prem. Power BI is on my desktop on-prem. I'm going to publish this to Power BI service, not on-prem, right? So when I do that, I have to select where I want to publish this, and let's publish this to marketing, all right? That's my workspace in Power BI. That's where I'm publishing it. So let's go look at what I just did. Power BI. Marketing, I have no reports or data sets other than this one I just published. Okay, so let's make sure that one's finished. It is finished. So if I go and look at that, sorry for the switching, and I look at this report, same report, right? I just published it. Of course, it's the same report. So if I go to SQL Server and I go to that table, which is this one, and let's say I want to edit. All right, so just to show you, this is again on-prem SQL. Let's just change the dates on here so I can show you what this entails or how it functions. All right, so I've changed that table. I'm going to go back to Power BI. I'm going to go to the data sets. I need to configure how this data set is connecting to the on-prem data. So if you remember what I talked about with Flow, we had to create a connector, tell Flow how it's getting to that data and what data gateway it's going through. We have to do the same thing for our data sets. So we go to settings for this data set. I've already actually configured a gateway for this data set previously. So I'm going to use it. I'm going to click apply. Your data set will not work until you do this. It will not refresh. Okay. So now that we've applied that to this data set, go back to the data set, and I'm going to do a refresh. It's going to go and grab the new data that we've just updated in the SQL table. I'll go back to the report, do a refresh, and then I'm going to see that 2015 year that's been reflected that when I edited the table in SQL Server. And let's go check back to see if our data from our on-prem SharePoint list got added to the table for our events. So I'm going to add this, and voila, it did get added. This is the one we added, the Lunch and Learn for 100 people. So yay, it did get added. So powerful stuff. We're able to really report on all our on-prem data, move our data using Flow. I hope you see the power in that and see how easy it was for us to do that for our users. Again, here's my contact information. Would love to connect with you after the conference as well. Thank you for joining us for MVP Days.